Hello Blender heads and welcome back to another speed sculpting video. I am Jamie Dunbar from Dragon Boot Studios and this week we're going to be sculpting this Gremlin character. Now I realise that I've been absent for a couple of weeks. That's because this is one of the biggest projects I've probably ever taken on, and certainly the biggest I've taken on this particular channel. There is 30 plus hours worth of sculpting to get this character completed. So obviously there's a lot of sculpting work involved, and then there's a lot of time to also edit the video, which is also 30 hours plus long. So this is a Gremlin from the movie Gremlins, which is an iconic movie, but admittedly a little bit of an old one now, being created in 1984, which means that movie is older than I am. But it was a really amazing movie well before CGI and 3D animation became a thing at all. So all of these creatures and little monsters were all created with puppetry. And these are probably some of the most advanced puppets you've ever seen. Like, these things were really, really cool for their time. And I have to say, having gone and sat down and watched this movie as part of my research for this character, they do still really stand up. That said, if you look really closely in some of the scenes, you can see the little sticks and stuff that they use to move their arms and such around. So as fantastic as these movies were, even by today's standards, they could still be improved by some 3D animation. So I decided to give myself a challenge and try and tackle a much more realistic creature compared to what I've been doing up until now. So in this video we'll be covering blocking, which you can already see happening now. There will be a remeshing process where we'll take this blocking and merge it all into the one piece of geometry, which we'll then do a little bit of base sculpting on. We'll then retopologize the mesh and go in and do a final detailed sculpt to add all of our scales and wrinkles and all that lovely fine detail. The references you can see in the background here are a model created by Jeff Everhart. Now his design is pretty good, but the main reason that I chose these reference images was because he's one of the only artists that provided a front, back and side view of our Gremlin here. So having all of these views is a really solid place to start and gives us our base silhouette, which we can then build upon. The image you can see in the top right hand corner is by Martin Verhoeven. I apologise in advance, I've probably butchered your name, Martin. But his design was one of the favourites that I came across, and I reference it heavily. One of my other favourite references was by Matthew Frossard, but there was probably half a dozen or so other artists that I referenced, and obviously also referenced the movie itself. I'll make sure that there's links in the description to all of the artists that I've just mentioned. Now the blocking stage for this character was particularly important because you can tell by its design that it's got a lot going on here. He's obviously got a lot of spikes and teeth and pointy eyebrows and kind of Tyrannosaurus legs going on there. But as well as that, his anatomy is just much more realistic compared to some of the characters that I've been working on before now. So Yoshi, for example, is predominantly a bunch of spheres that are kind of thrown together. Spyro gets a little bit more realistic and actually has some anatomy that you have to deal with. But this Gremlin really has much more defined muscles, like you can make out the biceps and the calves and the abs. And as well as that, he has much more human proportions, which we're much more familiar with looking at, so if something's wrong, it's much easier for us to tell that it's wrong. The major task to get done in this blocking phase is to make sure that you get all of your shapes in. So a lot of this is just smashing spheres into place and kind of stretching them out to form the muscle shapes. I do add some secondary shapes in so that we can get things like the pectoral muscles or the arm and the leg muscles. To keep everything moving fast and fluid here, I'm mostly using just spheres and cubes. Whenever I feel like I need a little bit more detail, I just add an extra subdivision modifier and apply it. Now instead of adding subdiv modifiers, you could use Topo or Remesh at this stage. Just be careful not to add more detail than you need. The more polygons you have, the harder it becomes to move things around. So keep everything loose, low poly, and easy to change. The whole point of this stage is to try and get all of the major shapes into place. So by the end of this you should have a really strong silhouette and you should be able to look at it and immediately tell what it is, in this case a Gremlin. To get the face right, I did need to change up my workflow a little bit. The face is just a little bit too complicated for working with just smashing a bunch of spheres together like I've been doing so far. So in this case, I jump into remesh earlier than any other part of the body, just so I can get those slightly different shapes into place early on. Now don't be too worried if your sculpt looks a little bit goofy early on. This gremlin with its big wide open mouth looked a little bit like a scary clown for a really long time. Understand that a lot of this goofiness will disappear as you add more detail. This is why you'll find that even some of the greatest sculptors in the world say that their models always go through a stage where they kind of question their own abilities. After you've done this for a little while, you realize that this is kind of just part of the sculpting and even the modeling process, and you just kind of have to trust your own ability to be able to push through it. That said, it is important to identify why your model looks goofy at this stage so that you know how to fix it. One of the biggest problems I've found is often the eyelids. Beginners quite frequently forget to add eyelids at all, and you end up with this really wide-eyed expression. So adding eyelids early makes a really big difference. In this case, it turned out to be a combination of the eyelids and needing to add in the teeth. You can see that as soon as I add the teeth, the gremlin immediately starts to look a lot more threatening. With all my basic shapes in place, it's time to remesh all this geometry together. Now at this point I still want to keep some parts of the body separate so it's easier to move things around. So instead of remeshing everything, I start by just remeshing the head parts together. Now you could grab all the parts of the head and just hit remesh, but I wanted a little bit more control than that. So I choose to remesh one piece of geometry at a time. This allows me to fine-tune my remesh settings for each piece, ensuring that I get to keep all the details that I want. So although it's looking heaps better, the face is still looking just a little bit goofy. So I spent a bit of time adding some of the secondary shapes, such as the large wrinkles behind the mouth and around the cheek area. I also defined this bony ridge below the eye. With these secondary details in place, you can see that the face has really started to take some shape. Although there's still tons of work to do, it now looks more like a gremlin and less like a scary clown face. So at this point, I'm ready to go back to the body and start adding some extra details there. The armour plates on the legs, shoulders and wrists were a little bit of a difficult choice. That choice being, do I remesh these areas and then sculpt the armour by hand, or do I add them now as separate pieces of geometry? Now there's no hard and fast rule here, you could choose to go down either path. Now in my case, because they help define the silhouette quite a bit, I decided that I wanted to add them now as their own meshes, and then remesh them back into the body later. I created the armour plates by making a plane and adding a shrink wrap and a solidify modifier. Then you can just reshape and extrude the edges to get the plate the right shape. I also add a subdiv modifier to smooth out the shape a little bit. Tweaking the crease options in the solidify modifier helps sharpen the edges and kind of works like a fake bevel modifier. The shoulders are exactly the same workflow, although they were a little more fiddly as I had to wrap the plates a full 180 degrees around the shoulder. I've remeshed the torso geometry into one new mesh, still keeping it separate from the arms, legs and head. Doing it this way helps keep poly count for the scene lower, as I don't need as much detail in the torso as I say need for the face, for example. And keeping some areas separate gives me greater control to continue shaping the parts independently. After quickly smoothing some of the joining areas, I start adding some of the larger secondary details, such as the large scale wrinkles on the back, near the tail, and the armour plates around the shoulders. Once I'm finally happy with the overall silhouette, I remesh the arms and legs into the torso. Now I realise at this point that I've somehow broken the mirroring on the armour plates on the legs. Fortunately, there's an option to symmetrise your mesh under the Symmetry tab in your sculpting tools. At this point I'm starting to add more details, but they're still the details that you can see in the character's silhouette, so we're still a long way off adding details like small scale wrinkles or scales and skin pores. Next I turn to adding the armour plating down the back and the tail. Masking is going to be your friend for adding this kind of organic detail. So mask out the shape that you want, invert the mask, and use the move tool to pull out the shape. With this level of detail in my sculpt, I'm mostly using the clay and the crease brush. I use the clay brush to build up volume. The crease brush is used to carve into the mesh, or if you invert the brush with control, to create sharp edges. I'll also often mask out areas and use the move tool to shift shapes around. Try and avoid using the smooth brush too much, as the mesh is still fairly low poly and smoothing can simply just destroy the shapes that you've built. That's not to say don't use it, just be careful with it. Be aware that having Dyn Topo turned on can prevent you from creating really sharp edges with the crease brush, as it's rebuilding the geometry as you sculpt. I like to rough out these details for now and then get those really sharp edges after I've done my retopologize. All the armour detail on the shoulders is pretty much the same workflow as the plates on the tail. For the larger plates on the upper shoulders, I use the masking and move method. For these more scaly sections in the middle of the back, it's almost all done with the crease brush by carving in the lines, and then inverting the brush and tracing the edges to make the scales sharper. I add the little eyebrow bumps here, again using masking to help get the shapes that I want. These are a really nice detail as they help break up the otherwise large, smooth planes of his eyebrows. I realise here that I've forgotten to add the armour plates on the feet. Now as you can see, adding these in sculpt mode isn't really any more difficult than adding them as their own meshes like I did early on. Ultimately it's a personal choice which method you want to use. As with the armour on the back, using masks and the grab brush or the move tool is the best way to pull out this geometry. I spend a bit of time reshaping the fingertips. It's important to get this particular shape here as the nails aren't just kind of shoved on the end of the finger, they need to look like they've grown out of it. While I'm here, I spend a bit of time detailing the hand. Now the skin is very close to the bones on the hand, so defining which parts are bony, which parts are padded, and where all the major wrinkles are is really important to getting the right shapes. Similarly to faces, we're really intimately aware of the shape and feel of hands, because we spend quite a bit of time looking at our own. That said, hands are also intricately detailed and can move in a lot of different ways. The way that the skin moves around bone and tendons and the wrinkles that form around the fatty padded parts is really detailed, so pay special attention to what pose your hand is in when you sculpt, as it can change quite dramatically. The mouth is looking a little bit weird and empty, so I quickly model a simple tongue before finally merging the head and the body into one mesh. This is the last remesh I need to do, and our gremlin is finally all combined. I smooth out all the line joints around his neck and reshape the back of his head before adding the large wrinkles down his neck. His shoulder armour has been largely ignored up until now, so I detail these up by carving in some individual plates. This is done almost exclusively by using the crease brush to cut in the lines and inverting it to sharpen any edges. In the references I'm using, his abs aren't particularly well defined, but I want at least a hint of some muscle around this area. So I carve in some deeper shapes to get the anatomy in the right place before smoothing over most of it so it's not too defined. My final step before retopology is to add these little scale details to the legs. Now these details probably should have been left until after I did the retopology, as they're a little bit too much detail to try and add with Topo. These are much easier to create with good topology after you've added the multi-res modifier. I end up having to go over a fair bit of this detail again. I'm not going to spend too much time on retopology in this video for a couple of reasons. Firstly, this is a fairly complex model, and all the armour plates sticking out makes for some fairly intricate topology. It's really not the best model to try and teach with. The other reason is I tried using the retopoflow add-on for this project. Retopoflow was an amazing add-on in earlier versions of Blender, but since 2.8 it's been going through a massive overhaul and it's currently still in beta. A new beta update had recently been launched and I wanted to see if it could be used in production yet. Retopoflow is an incredibly powerful retopology add-on, and considering it's in beta, I still found it to be really stable. It did crash on me a couple of times, but it only crashes Retopoflow, it doesn't completely crash Blender. Which means you only have to restart Retopoflow, you don't actually lose any of your work, which is really cool. That said, I did find it to be quite slow after adding a lot of geometry, and towards the end it became almost unusable. So you could probably be using it on some mid-detail sculpts, but for something with as much detail as this Gremlin here, it's probably not quite ready yet. So being a paid add-on and in its current beta state, I can't quite recommend Retopoflow, but I remember how awesome it was in Blender 2.79, and I'm confident it's going to be amazing again once it's finished. I'd still say it's the most complete retopology tool for Blender, it just needs a little bit more development time. While working on this video, I learned of a few new topology tools and techniques, so keep your eyes peeled in the next few weeks as I intend to do a couple of detailed tutorials covering each of the new methods. Broadly speaking though, for good topology you want to make sure you have good edge flow with your loops running around the muscles and the joints, as you can see with the leg here. Similarly, you want to make sure that your edges line up with the pronounced features, like the armour plates on the wrist here. The same goes for the features of the face. Make sure that you have edge loops that run around the major landmarks, such as the eyes, nose and mouth. Also make sure that the shapes of your polygons is as square as possible and evenly distributed. You want to avoid having stretched polygons in the shape of rectangles. It's also important not to try to overcomplicate your retopology. With a creature as detailed as this, it can be really tempting to add all sorts of fancy edge loops and trying to conform to all the different shapes. I did fall into this trap a little bit and ended up with some very messy topology, particularly around the shoulders, with edges being far too close to each other. This isn't a big deal for sculpting, and you can even get away with it when you rig your character, but if you're planning on doing some more advanced like feature film type rigging such as dynamic muscles or skin deformations, it's really important to keep your polygons as even as possible. So this part where I'm adding all the extra edge loops to line up with the individual plates, don't do this. This is an example of overcomplicating, and you'll see at the end I go back and fix this by removing all of these extra edge loops. With a model this complicated, it's still inevitable that you'll end up with a lot of edge loops in detailed areas like the face, which then add too much detail in other areas like the top of the head and down the spine. Remember that you can use edge loops that return back on themselves to terminate those extra edge loops and prevent them from going into less detailed areas, like you can see me doing with the head here. This is an essential technique to learn if you want to start doing these high detailed characters. We're going to leave it there for the Gremlin sculpt for now. In part 2, I'll show you how to reproject all the details from your high poly sculpt onto this new retopologized mesh. Here you can see the final wireframe for the retopologized Gremlin. There's been quite a few things tidied up, but pay special attention to how much cleaner the shoulder area now looks. You can see the Gremlin morph between the low poly retopologized mesh and the detailed sculpt. This is what I'll show you how to do at the start of the next video before sculpting our final super high resolution details. I'll see you then.